What's going on, everyone? Lon here from Android Authority, and in front of me I have the Razer Phone 2. This is the successor to last year's Razer phone, and the Razer Phone 2 improves on some of the things that people complained about with last year's Razer phone, and also adds in a couple of new features. And the Razer Phone 2 is a phone that I consider to be a phone that's not afraid to go against the grain, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. But the Razer Phone 2 is priced at $799 or 800 bucks. And for that 800 bucks, you're getting some really beefy specs. You have a Snapdragon 845 processor, 8 gigabytes of RAM, 64 gigs of internal storage with a micro SD card slot, a 4,000 milliamp hour battery, and new to the Razer phone this year is IP67 certification. And you guys already know what this means. This means you can drop it in the pool, drop it in the toilet, and it will survive. Also new to the Razer phone is it now has wireless charging, Qi wireless charging, which means you can use any Qi compatible wireless charger of your choice. But Razer also sells their own wireless charger, which lights up RGB, which you can purchase for an additional $100. I think the only thing that Razer sort of skimped out on is the internal storage. 64 gigabytes is usually more than enough for me on any other smartphone, but for a phone that is centered around gaming, where you might be downloading a lot of games, which will eat at your internal storage pretty quickly, 64 gigs seems a little bit low. It does have the micro SD card slot for expandable storage, but I think this phone definitely should have had 128 gigabytes internally at the very least. So here's what I mean when I say the Razer Phone 2 goes against the grain. If you look at the Razer Phone 2 next to a Galaxy S9, a Pixel 3, or really any other smartphone on the market, it looks very different. Instead of being this curvy design with rounded corners, the Razer Phone 2 is just a black rectangular sharp slab. It's pretty much the same design as last year's Razer phone. The only exception here is that it now has a glass back, which is how they've enabled the wireless charging. And the design of the Razer Phone 2 is not my favorite. I typically prefer my phones to be more curvy. I like designs of phones like the Pixel 3 and the Galaxy S9 or even the iPhone XS a lot better. You may feel a little bit differently about it, but that's just how I feel about this particular design. There are certain elements of it though that I do like. I like the large speaker grills on the front for the dual front firing speakers, which sound incredibly loud, by the way, and it also delivers a very even and balanced sound. There's no overemphasis on bass or treble, which is the problem that I had with the Pixel 3 speakers. I thought those were a little bit flat and also not very loud for front-facing speakers. So I like the speakers on the Razer Phone 2 a lot better. I also like the new RGB logo on the back for the three-headed snake. You can adjust it and make it static, make it breathing, or have it cycle through a whole spectrum of colors. And aside from just looking really cool, it doesn't have a ton of utility. You can use it for notifications and stuff like that, but it's really just meant to make it look more like a gaming product, and it certainly does do that. So I like the new RGB logo. I also like that they've centered the camera sensors on the back. There is a pretty sizable camera bulge, but because the cameras are perfectly centered, it doesn't wobble when you have it laying flat on a table or desk. The only other thing that I don't like about the Razer Phone 2's design is how recessed the power button is. I do like that the fingerprint sensor is integrated into the power button, and I think that's something that more manufacturers should do, but because the power button is so recessed, it's actually really hard to find by feel when it's in your pocket or when you're just trying to wake the phone up when it's on a table or desk just to check your notifications. So one of the biggest selling points of the original Razer phone and the Razer Phone 2 is the 120 Hz display. So this is pretty much the same display as last year's Razer phone, but Razer has made this display brighter, so it's actually visible outdoors now, which was one of the big complaints about last year's model. But this is a pretty traditional smartphone display. It doesn't have a notch, so if you don't like notches, there you go. And it's also 16:9 instead of that taller and narrow aspect ratio that we're seeing on a bunch of other smartphones. but the 120 hertz display is still just as incredible as ever. Everything just looks so silky smooth, and it's awesome for gaming, especially if you're playing one of the 120 FPS supported titles, which there are actually a pretty good selection of. So those games are extremely fun, and even just swiping and scrolling through Android is a lot more enjoyable just because of how silky smooth everything looks. And I've ran this display at 120 hertz out of the box. It does default to 90 hertz, which is probably for battery saving purposes, but I've had no issues with battery life even with running this display at 120 hertz full time. I'm still getting a pretty consistent 5 hours of screen on time, but I'm pretty sure if you turn the refresh rate down to 90 hertz or even 60 hertz, you'll probably squeeze out even more battery life. There's no real surprises with the software on the Razer Phone 2. It's running basically a stock build of Android 8.1 Oreo, but some of the system UI elements and the default apps have been themed with Razer colors. It's also running Nova Launcher as the default launcher, which gives you a very stock-like look and feel, but it offers a ton more customization. I would say the biggest disappointment with the software on the Razer Phone 2 is that it's not running Android Pie out of the box, and I feel like this would have given the Razer Phone 2 a big competitive advantage over a lot of other smartphones, because there aren't a ton of smartphones out there right now that are running Android Pie. Speaking of disappointments, I wasn't a big fan of the cameras on the Razer Phone 2, and supposedly they're much improved over last year's Razer phone, and maybe I've just been spoiled by the Pixel 3's picture quality, but I wasn't very impressed by the images on the Razer Phone 2. You have two 12 megapixel cameras on the rear, one standard angle and one telephoto zoom lens for 2x optical zoom, and then you have an 8 megapixel camera on the front that now supports 1080p video at 60 frames per second, which is really great if you're into self-vlogging, but the image quality is just okay. The colors come out a little bit muted and washed out to me, and dynamic range is also not very good. You get very little detail in the highlights and shadows, and that becomes even more visible when you're shooting in low light. The photos from the main camera also have this really weird green tinge or color cast to them, which makes photos look very unnatural and very unattractive. Portrait mode on this camera is also one of the most artificial looking portrait modes that I've seen on a smartphone in a while. The bokeh effect just doesn't really look that convincing to me, especially on the front-facing camera, and the front-facing camera also lacks a ton of dynamic range. Despite the bad camera, this is still a really great smartphone. You're getting a very beefy spec sheet, a 120 hertz display that looks amazing, and it also doesn't have a notch, for all well under $1,000. And if you're really big into mobile gaming, this is the perfect phone to do it with. Now, if you're coming from the original Razer phone, I don't think this is worth the upgrade. I don't think the changes are significant enough, but as an upgrade in general, it's a phone that's definitely worth looking into. It pretty much checks all the right boxes. It has great performance, a great display, pretty good battery life. Just don't buy this phone for the camera, and I think you'll be perfectly happy with your purchase. But that's it for this review. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, give it a thumbs up. I definitely appreciate it. Subscribe to the channel down below, and also check the website for more in-depth coverage, androidauthority.com, and I will talk to you guys in the next video.